Governance has been an overused term. People, whether politicians, professionals, or ordinary people, use the word governance callously. Yet we cannot blame them as the concept of governance itself has a plurality of meanings. Some refer to governance as institutions, some pertain to the concept as actions of leadership and governing, others view it extensively as the interaction between the public and private sectors. Despite these multiple meanings of the word governance, a uniting thread binds these definitions, that our understanding of governance is rooted from the Western historical experience of democratic governance, that to some extent is inapplicable to certain Asian contexts. Our study entitled The Principles of Moral Governance in the Bangsamoro intends to address this challenge about the incompatibility of our conventional notions and ideas of governance to the Bangsamoro region. Our research pursued a threefold objective. First, we explored what constitutes to the Western idea of governance based on the prescriptive criteria provided by multilateral organizations. Second, we explored the canons of Islamic philosophy to unearth themes that comprise the idea of Islamic governance. Lastly, upon comparing between the two, we located the presence of Islamic governance principles in the Bangsamoro Organic Law. In the circle of practitioners and policymakers, the idea of good governance is usually associated with a democratic framework promoted by multilateral organizations. This democratic framework is characterized by the following qualities: accountable, consensus-oriented, equitable, efficient and inclusive, participatory, responsiveness, transparent, and rule of law. These qualities are indeed noble and necessary for the achievement of a just, humane, and peaceful society. However, our understanding on how to achieve these qualities to fulfill the criteria of good governance is a little bit problematic. Why? Number 1. These good governance characteristics are assumed to become institutionalized by placing governmental structures to ensure that the persons inside the governance machinery shall comply and practice these values. Number 2. The view that these characteristics shall be achieved by placing institutions assumes a linear path of development. However, such is not the case because the idea of progression of good governance was lifted from the bastion of liberal democracy. In addition, these good governance characteristics are also automatically accepted as applicable to all situations, regardless of each political entity's historical background. Number 3, these ideas of good governance were cultivated in the Western democratic context where secularism, or the separation of religion and politics in the public sphere, is widely accepted. Unfortunately, given these premises, realizing good governance based on these precepts is a challenge in the Bangsamoro region, a political entity with rich history of development, conflict and progress, as well as a situation with different social capital compared to the democratic West. In fact, one of the problems in the Bangsamoro region is the continued corruption, particularly in the practice of entrenched clientelism, which harbors and sustains nepotism. With the Bangsamoro Transition Authority in place, people are now optimistic to become a part of the hope to achieve a good life, being guided by social ethics and communal values of trust, justice, peace, and equality. However, the young, idealistic, and deserving aspiring public servants are being disregarded in favor of candidates with connections with political leaders because of nepotism. From this critique of our conventional ideas of good governance derived from the West and nepotism in the region, what is the solution to institute good governance in the Bangsamoro? Our study invites our audience to revisit the Islamic roots and identity of Bangsamoro. The teachings of Islam itself serves as a pillar from the achievement of what we call Islamic moral governance in Bangsamoro. What is the difference between the Western notion of good governance from Islamic moral governance? The difference lies on the view of emergence of good governance. For the Western view, good governance can be achieved by placing institutions that will influence the behavior of government leaders. We can call it as deductive, perhaps. On the other hand, Islamic moral governance is inductive. It starts from an individual's acceptance to the teachings of Islam up to its application to the macro level. If good governance has its own characteristics prescribed by multilateral organizations, Islamic moral governance has its own quality, which are axioms derived from Islamic philosophy. These axioms are grouped into 5 immutable principles of Islamic governance. Faith. At the personal level, the virtue of faith refers to total submission to Islamic teachings, particularly with the divine lordship of Allah and the need for purification. At the governance level, leaders must accept that the human reality is not separate from divine reality. The principle of faith is particularly embedded in the preamble of Bangsamoro Organic Law. Freedom. In Islamic ethic philosophy, freedom at the individual level refers to the capacity to choose what is good and what is better. On the governance level, the principles of freedom refers to the liberty to make decisions without restrictions. In addition, freedom in making government decisions must be anchored in responsibility and accountability. In the BOL, the principle of freedom is found in Article 4, which is the general principles and policies, and Article 9, Section 5, which is religious freedom. Moral authority. At the individual level, the Islamic understanding of moral authority refers to two dimensions: belief in the oneness of God and emulation of Prophet Muhammad as the epitome of strong leadership. Consequently, subscriptions to these ideals must translate into implementation of policies anchored in equality and universal solidarity. This principle is presented in the BOL in Article 4, Section 3, 4, and 5, the democratic system of Bangsamoro, and Article 9, Section 11, the women's participation. Common good. Islam understands common good based on two terms: public welfare and public interest. These ideals convince a believer to generate a spirit of voluntarism. In terms of governance, common good refers to equality and capacity to induce reform and positive social change, virtues that enable man to become vice-regents. In the BOL, the principle of common good is placed in Article 5, Section 3, that discusses the powers of the Bangsamoro government to provide social welfare to its people. And lastly, social ethics. Islam views social ethics as the interrelationship between trust, community, justice, peace, and human equality. Individual and community compliance to these virtues is required. These ideals are contextualized in the Bangsamoro Organic Law in Article 4, Section 7 and 6, Article 9, Sections 6, 8, 10, 13, and 14, and the Article 13, Section 12. These provisions tackle the topics of promotion of social unity, social justice, minority rights, human rights, access to basic services, labor rights, youth and children's rights, and indigenous rights to natural resources. To end the discussion, our study presented the stark differences between the Western notion of good governance and Islamic moral governance. Good governance, being grounded in the Western experience, is rooted from liberal and secular democratic traditions and tends to impose its validity and superiority because of its universalistic assumptions. On the other hand, our exploration of Islamic moral governance aims to present that the establishment of democratic institutions need to account the local cultural context of the area. History proves that the arbitrary building of institutions and practices disregarding a locality's history and culture has been a usual case of failed political experiments. Therefore, we believe that institutionalizing the aforementioned Islamic values will contribute to address governance problems in the Bangsamoro region, including corruption and political clientelism, and to usher BARMM to achieve its political maturity.